I'm Carlos Greer, senior reporter at Page Six, and it's the end of the first week of Sean Diddy Combs' trial, and like so many of you, I've got questions. Here to break down what happened in the courtroom this week is entertainment lawyer, former litigator, and legal correspondent Lisa Bonner. Lisa, how you doing, my friend?
I am well, Carlos. How are you?
I am doing well. Needless to say, it's been an explosive week for Diddy's trial. Cassie testified, and we got a real glimpse into their very dark and violent world she was living in from her mouth. But she's not on trial. Diddy is. And there are too many headlines to keep up with, frankly. So before we dive in, remind us how Diddy got here. What are the charges that he's facing?
The defendant is facing several charges. The defendant is facing a RICO charge. He is also facing the sex trafficking and the transportation of individuals for the purposes of prosecution. This was all framed under a RICO statute as well. So I think it's important, and we'll get into that and how that works. But that is the nutshell of the case.
Well, tell me, how does that work?
Basically, what the SDNY is trying to establish is that the event, and I'm going to read directly from the indictment, so to be clear, the defendant abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influences of the business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. And they are bringing this through a RICO case. And the way the RICO case is generally brought is, I like to talk about a RICO like a funnel, right? A RICO, generally, you charge as many people as you can to get to the mob boss, the crime boss, the John Gotti's, if you will. But it's important to remember in a federal case that they don't need to disclose who their witnesses are going to be, who anybody who is going to testify is going to be. That can be kept under seal. That's why there's so much anticipation and questions over who, what, why, when, who's next, what are they going to say, all of the things. So basically what they're saying is that the RICO, the enterprise, existed for the purposes of Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise to engage in these unlawful acts of violence, sex trafficking, forced labors, right? And securing absolute loyalty from the members of the Combs enterprise through acts of violence and through threats.
So this is so much bigger than Cassie, which everyone has been focusing on this week.
It has very little to do with Cassie. Cassie is one of many people that the feds are going to come forth and proffer this, this information, this testimony, this witness of how this RICO and how this criminal enterprise worked. Dawn Richard is supposedly next up on the stand. The members of Danity Kane. There are a lot of people who are going to come forward that we believe are going to come forward and testify. Cassie went on probably as the first witness, one, because she is the star witness, but also she is 8.5 months pregnant. So when you were listening to the prosecution's opening statement, they said, we're going to paint a picture of all of this, and that might not be linear, but you're going to understand how this works. So they put Cassie, because literally her testimony had to be finished today because she is 8.5 months pregnant and can go into labor at any time. At that point, if she were to go to labor on the stand, that could immediately cause a mistrial for the prosecution.
Right, so essentially they're setting it up.
Correct. They are laying just a bit of the groundwork. Week one of potentially an 8-month trial. So an 8-week trial. So we've got 7 weeks essentially to go.
Right. So you've been following this trial very closely. And, as you mentioned, we heard from Cassie, who gave an explosive testimony. What's your reaction to the first week, and what stood out to you?
Well, what stood out to me was Cassie's very graphic testimony, which both of them acknowledged was, Diddy acknowledged in his people in his opening statement, his defense attorneys established that, listen, he was abusive, he was violent, but his violence don't amount to crimes. That's what they said in the opening statement. But in the prosecution's opening statement, they said he was violent, and the sexual violence and the domestic violence is just part and parcel to this RICO charge. So they are right now just laying out the elements. Cassie showed you how allegedly he took away her agency. She was forced, she was coerced. Sure, she had some participation in the freak offs, but at what point is her consent removed? And that's what we're looking for. We're not looking at each individual time. You're looking at the totality of the circumstances. Overall, looking at this 19-year-old girl, he was 37 when they got involved, almost twice her age. Did this man remove her agency? Did she feel like she had free will to leave? And they are establishing times when she tried to leave. The video established she tried to leave. He brought her back. She tried to leave. Some gentleman came next to me and sat on the plane and showed me an iPad full of tapes from the freak offs. You know, people he sent to bring her back. Some of his associates, employees, people that work for him were sent when she would leave. She repeatedly established that she tried to leave, and he would bring her back. You're not looking at the 19-year-old girl now on the stand. You're looking at a 38-year-old woman who has been through therapy, through trauma therapy, to try and deal with what she has gone through. And we can talk about that later and how that factors into the case. Yeah. But it's very important.
And I would imagine that you're probably going to hear a lot of this from whomever takes the stand in the upcoming weeks as well. But this is a very serious case, obviously, and Diddy, he is facing life in prison. What is the strategy? What did you notice about the defense's strategy?
Well, the defense's strategy is she always had consent. You know, she was there as a willing participant. She was jealous. Diddy was on drugs. You know, they're using that to poke holes in his state of mind. It doesn't matter if you're on drugs and you commit a crime. It doesn't matter. So they are throwing a lot of red herrings. I mean, they're trying to do the best with what they have. But one thing that people need to understand about federal cases and the SDNY in particular, generally when the feds come to you, they have a case. Yeah. They have a case. The SDNY has over a 95% conviction rate, and they are the largest and most powerful district court in the country. The borough of Manhattan, the financial centers are all within the jurisdiction of the SDNY. They have plenty of evidence and plenty of experience in prosecuting RICO cases, sex trafficking, and these kidnapping and arson cases. This is a very serious case. And it's also important to remember that Harvey Weinstein, Jeffrey Epstein, all of these prior defendants were convicted of the same thing. Yeah. Some in state court and some in federal court. But the only thing the difference is the state of mind. State court has a lower presumption and a burden of proof.
Right. So what are your thoughts on how the prosecution is arguing their case?
I think that they are, again, we talked about them just laying out just step one of their star witness and really establishing the fact that she did not have free will. She was not really overall consenting. And what people are saying, well, she stayed. That really is not the correct way to look at a case like this. What you are doing is, what did he allegedly do to make her think that she did not have the ability to leave?
Yeah, let's talk about that, because I know that you've worked with in domestic violence and domestic abuse cases. This, I've talked to people, I'm sure you're talking to people, and, reading the comments and all of that. And there seems to be some division over what constitutes as sex trafficking. So be crystal clear. What is sex trafficking and how does it relate to their relationship?
Sex trafficking is one that you are moving the witness, the transportation of a witness for purposes of sex that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. Does not have to necessarily be across state lines. That does not have to be the case. The transportation of a witness, moving her from his home or her home to a hotel for the purposes of sex induced by force, fraud, or coercion. That is what sex trafficking is. Now, the transportation is another issue. We're talking when we're talking about that in the case of the sex trafficking, but we are looking at the transportation of witnesses for the purpose of sex induced by force, fraud, or coercion.
Okay. So how does Cassie testifying help the prosecution's case?
Because what she was saying is that, listen, I was in a relationship with him, and I was trafficked for sex, by purposes of force, fraud, or coercion, sometimes by guns, sometimes by him, looking at the video, looking at, I tried to leave, he dragged me back, he sent his people, his goons, if you will, after me. So if also you're looking at a situation through blackmail, right? Through if you're going to say you can't leave, or I'm going to release this iPad of videos of these freak offs, well then what do I feel like I have the agency to stay on my own free will? It's important to remember in every sexual encounter, what is explicit is consent. And you're taking away the consent. And people say, oh, well, she stayed, she consented, perhaps she did in certain circumstances, but really you're looking at her state of mind. Did she really feel like, did she understand whether or not that she had the ability to leave? She tried. And they're probably going to bring her mother on the witness stand to really talk about the times that she really talked to her mother about it and how that factored in and what happened. And her mother could testify to the fact that she was brought back. So, you have to look at it in terms of what I always say. Nobody is really talking about Stockholm syndrome, right? Which is when the abused tends to sympathize and cover up for the abuser. This happens a lot in child abuse cases. You are faced with an individual, a child, for instance, when DHS comes to the child's home and the child has bruises on the body. And did your mother or your father do this to you? No, I fell down the steps. Because you think about it, if you take away their protector, their provider, what is going to happen to them? I don't know. This girl was 19. And, Wendy Williams talked about it all the time. Did you know that if she was going to get away, where was she going? Did she have any money? No, because he was her employer. Aside from her boyfriend, she was signed to a 10-album deal. And let's talk about that. In the music industry, 6 to 7 is the normal. Right. She was signed to 10. And it's not a 10-year deal, because it is, that's a story for another discussion. It is a 10-album deal, and each album cycle lasts a couple of years. She had one album, and that was never, ever, ever put out. And so he kept talking to her, I'm going to, go into the studio, I'm going to put out this album, and nothing ever came out. It was a carrot that was allegedly dangled in front of her to keep her in this relationship with him.
So like another form of control, essentially.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely control.
So talk to me about the defense. What do you foresee them doing? They have to prove to 8 men and 4 women who make up that jury that their client is innocent. What have been the tactics that you've noticed this week that they're using?
The defense's job is to poke holes in their theory so you can get to beyond a reasonable doubt. With a reasonable person think and believe what the prosecution is stating. So their job is to poke holes into their theory, into their complaint, if you will. And that is what they are trying to do. Well, you consented, you were a part of these freak offs, you set these freak offs off. And like we talked about before, why did she do this? That goes to her state of mind. Again, force, fraud, or coercion. And that is really important in terms of the sex trafficking, in terms of the other things that have happened in the RICO case, where you're talking about arson, bribery, kidnapping, all of those things that lends itself to Cassie as well. But they're going to try and poke holes in every witness that the prosecution brings forward and try and plant that seed of doubt, if you will, in that person, in the juror's mind, that whatever they're talking about, no, he didn't do that. And that is what the defense's job is to do. Are they doing a very good job? In my legal opinion, I don't think so.
So that video, that extremely disturbing video of him physically attacking her at the former Intercontinental Hotel, what new information did we learn about that, and how significant is that footage?
I don't really think that we learned anything new from that, because it's been circulating for so long, but they did slow it down. They did take it frame by frame so they could talk about what was happening in her state of mind. And they were trying to establish, what were you trying to do? Were you running from a freak off? Was that what you were doing? And so she said, yes, I was trying to leave the hotel. They were trying to establish the force, right? The fact that she did not consent. Does that look like consent to you? So that is what the biggest takeaway from the video. But I dare say that the video, in the grand scheme of things, in the totality of the circumstances, is going to be some of the least, concerning evidence that we've seen. We've seen that before. So what is important in this case is not about Cassie. You're going to have other people come forward that are alleging the exact same things and establishing this is a pattern. That is why they're saying that Combs relied on his employees' resources and influence of that enterprise to create a criminal enterprise whose members were engaged in sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice.
Lisa, another thing that came out this week, their alleged drug use, well, not alleged, it was exposed that they were allegedly drug addicts, and Cassie was grilled about their drug use and alleged overdoses. What role do you think drugs play in all of this? And, what does that mean when you're trying to convince a jury or defend against sex trafficking allegations?
Well, again, they're trying to go to the defendants, to Diddy's state of mind. That is what the defense is trying to do. What Cassie is showing is that, listen, I had 96-hour freak-offs. And in the grand scheme of things, in the regular world of sexual escapades, I don't know many people that on their own could last 6 hours, let alone 96 hours. And this is not to be funny, but this is to really show you why she had to take drugs, ketamine, to stay up. They had to have hydration therapies afterwards. You're taking all these uppers, and not only was she taking uppers, but she was taking opiates to numb the pain. She talked about her UTIs. And most women that have ever had one know that it's very painful. Those are very painful. She said that she was forced into sex during a UTI, and she had sores in her mouth. And so a lot of that was to deal with the pain. She said to numb herself, to participate. These drugs were in things to keep them going, to numb the pain. And so that is something that is establishing, again, the force. I don't know anybody, whether you're a swinger or not. Nobody's here to judge anybody's sexual relationship and your proclivities, but a 96-hour sex marathon just isn't normal. And they had hundreds of them. Wow. And you cannot do that. I can't work 96 hours straight. Nobody can. It just sitting at my job, sitting at my computer typing, it's not possible. Yeah. And so that's what they're trying to show with the drugs.
Yeah, and you mentioned that they're trying to poke holes in her story.
Yeah.
So, there are text messages that there was consent with some of these freak-offs. We know about the $20 million settlement, and, there's been confusion and rumors around her requesting $30 million for a book to expose their relationship. Can you clear that up for us? What is the truth behind that?
And this was a bombshell takeaway from Cassie's testimony. Mm-hmm. She said that she went into trauma therapy, and it was established today that the therapist and the inpatient therapy that she went to was one of the best in the country. It was where a lot of the veterans go to deal with PTSD. They asked her, did you go there for sex addiction? No, I did not. I went there to deal with the after effects of the abuse. Mm-hmm. And to learn how to better myself. Because remember, what we also learned about her in this is when she was at a video shoot a couple of years ago, she went home. She had some triggered memories. She was married with 2 children at the time. And she went home to her husband and said, I can't do this anymore. You're better off without me, and tried to walk into traffic. At that point, he stopped her. She said she wanted to kill herself because she was dealing with all these post-traumatic issues. At that point, she went and she checked herself into rehab and into therapy, which was trauma therapy. And at the trauma center, and this is very well known through even women who go through divorces, one of the things that they tell you to do in trauma therapy to deal with some of these horrific memories is to write out what happened. Write it out. Talk to your abusers so they can really understand what you went through. And anybody can look it up. And that is what she did. She said she kept a trauma journal to try and deal with and deal with first on her own so she can sort through these things with her therapist. At that point, and when she was done with therapy, she said that I just wanted to get him to understand what happened to me, what he did, to take ownership. She was not necessarily looking for anything other than maybe perhaps an apology. Yeah. And she sent it to him and sent it also to somebody in his employ. And at that point, he never acknowledged it. It was, tossed around like a rag doll and never really acknowledged. So here's the other point that happened. At that point, after she had tried to really talk to him and just take ownership of what you did, an apology goes a long way. Mm-hmm. But if you're not even going to acknowledge what you did to me, okay, now we have a very small window of time. The New York Adult Survivors Act, that was a 1-year statute that was brought around because of the Me Too movement, which Harvey Weinstein was convicted of very similar charges. They had a 1-year window for that, right? And so at that point, she did hire an attorney, because I went through all this therapy, and I do know, and it's very common knowledge in the music industry, people know and are very familiar with the trauma that she has allegedly experienced. It's not a secret. And so at that point, yeah, she says, I want you to pay for what you did to me. You don't even acknowledge it. And so she did take, at that point, she went and hired an attorney. She did not write this for the purposes of a book. So I want to be clear about that, because what she did was what was instructed for her to do, what very many women, what survivors do, what divorced people go through to really just get through. I just want closure.
You mentioned that there's going to be more victims. We're expecting more victims to hit the stand in these next several weeks. What can we expect next week? There's reports that some of the Diddy gang members may take the stand. What do we know? And what do you think we'll hear?
We don't know anything. Again, like I said in the beginning of this, the federal government does not have to let us know who they have as witnesses, who they have as alleged victims. We don't know, but what we understand, what we think is going to happen is that Dawn Richard is going to come forward, and she is going to testify about some of the same treatment that she had received from him as a member of the group, and really talk about what happened to her. And it's important to understand that there is, although that these people are not, they have civil suits, and this is not a civil case, but they are tracking these people and these alleged victims, and the witnesses are all tracked from the civil case. So Dawn Richard is going to come and say, listen, there was a time when your people locked me in a car for 3.5 hours. I was repeatedly told what to do, how to dress. I was subjected to similar behavior. Okay, and so they're trying to establish that, and that is going to be one person that I believe that we will see. I believe that they will bring Cassie's mother to the stand at some point. If I had to really think about who else they would bring in to start talking about the RICO case, there is his chief of staff, Christina Karam, and she's charged with in at least 3 civil suits of procuring drugs and setting up hotel rooms to facilitate these freak-offs. There's Harvey Pierre, which is the president of Bad Boy. He was also named in a couple of lawsuits, and that Pierre persuaded her to travel at the age of 17, travel with him to Daddy's House recording studios, where she claims that Pierre Combs and another man raped her and so forcibly, so we will see more of these people come out. So, and then what they're going to start doing is, they'll come out with the victims, but they'll also start alleged victims and witnesses, but they'll really start at some point to establish these people who were involved, the bodyguard, the people that are really very high up in Combs' enterprise.
But we won't really know until as it goes on, as the weeks go on, as the days go on, we'll learn who they're talking to, who's going to take the stand. Right on. So, all right, Lisa Bonner, 7 more weeks to go. Thank you very much. I appreciate you stopping by and sharing your insight.
Well, thank you, and I hope that we were able to shed some light on this. And this is really important because this is not being tried in the public court of public opinion. But it is important to get the facts out. So whenever a jury comes to a decision, that people understand how this was set up, what the charges were, and who the witnesses were, and how this case stacked up. Also important to remember, just across the river in the Eastern District of New York, R. Kelly was charged and convicted of basically the same thing. I invite everybody to go and rewatch Surviving R. Kelly. Some of his victims were minors. Most of them were not.
Another sensational week in the Sean Diddy Combs federal sex trafficking trial. We learned more about the freak-offs and some of the sex workers involved. Cassie's mom testified, and Kid Cudi even took the stand. And of course, I've got questions. Joining me to connect the dots as to what this all means for Diddy and the trial is my friend, entertainment lawyer, former litigator, and legal correspondent, Lisa Bonner.
All right, Hi, Carlos.
Hello, Lisa. It's good to see you.
Good to see you as always.
All right, Lisa, let's cut through the noise. Last week, you said we're going to learn who will be in the courtroom in real time. And this week we saw Cassie's mom, Kid Cudi, one of Diddy's former employees, or a couple of his former employees. What stood out to you this week versus last? What was your takeaway?
Well, this was a very interesting case in terms of the prosecution beginning to paint the picture of the RICO charge. So if we could just reset the room a little bit and talk about the RICO charge so all of the viewers understand what the RICO charge, I know because that was one of the biggest questions last week. Like it was very much focused on domestic violence and Cassie, and I kept saying that is a mere part of it to set the stage. And now we are starting to hear from the prosecution about the alleged RICO. So just again, to read from the racketeering count in the overview, the prosecution is charging Diddy and stating that he abused, threatened, coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his conduct. To do so, Combs relied on the employees, resources, and influence of the multifaceted business empire that he led and controlled, creating a criminal enterprise whose members and associates engaged in and attempted to engage in, among other crimes, sex trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice. And they go on in the RICO charge to name other things such as possession of narcotics with the intent to distribute. We also talked, they just kind of laid it all out. So this week, as I read from the RICO charge, I think it's that you are starting to see, or the prosecution is really attempting to lay out and connect the dots about how he ran his company, what his employees did, who he relied on to carry out this criminal enterprise. So this is what the prosecution was doing this week, and versus last week, that's what I'm saying. Last week was a lot focused on just setting the stage with Cassie as she is victim number one.
Right. So how important are these testimonies as you lay out what's alleged in the RICO charges? How important are these testimonies and the people that we're hearing from?
Well, it's very important. So let's start with Cassie's mother. Cassie's mother was there to talk about and corroborate Cassie's story. The fact that she talked to her about wanting to leave and wanting to move and get away from Diddy. And she was an eyewitness to the abuse. She even had photographs, some of which we had not seen before. But I think the most important thing that we learned was the attempted alleged extortion of her, Sean asking for and demanding $20,000, or he was going to release the sex tape of Cassie. So her mother stated that she and her husband took out a loan, a home equity loan, in order to give Diddy the $20,000 that he had attempted or alleged to have extorted her, and then he paid it back a few days or a few weeks later. The paying back is not material. What is material in this instance is the extortion, which falls under other crimes in the RICO case.
So how damaging was her testimony to Diddy's case with that in mind?
I think it was very, in terms of starting, it's a jury question, but in terms of looking at it from a legal perspective, I think that she absolutely did some damage because, who else is closer to the mother but the daughter, right? And so the fact that Cassie had alleged these things and her mother was there from a firsthand perspective to corroborate her story with photographs. So that is powerful evidence, it's damning evidence. We also heard from some of Diddy's former assistants, two of them in particular, and one who was subpoenaed and given immunity in order to testify. Right. And the reason why the assistants are important is because they're alleging that he used his employees to carry out some of these criminal behaviors, which we heard that two of them were talking about that they carried large sums of cash for him. One of them was saying that he transported a gun for him, and he was in the car while they were riding around looking for Suge Knight, for example. And so a lot of the alleged behavior in terms of procuring drugs. So we heard a lot of what the prosecution was starting to allege in the indictment. And so I think the testimonies this week were very powerful in terms of connecting those dots and building out their prosecution's case of alleged RICO.
Right. Well, Lisa, let's go back to Cassie's mom, Regina Ventura. They didn't cross-examine her. Why do you think the defense declined to cross-examine her?
Because what I said, the mother and the daughter, that is a very powerful relationship, no matter how you look at it. And so in those instances, it's, what can you say? No, this didn't happen. I mean, you're going to make yourself look like a pretty big jerk if you're trying to cross-examine somebody's mother about what the daughter said. And she had photographs to back it up. And she apparently had the receipts to back up the $20,000. And so she was there to round out Cassie's testimony, which she did. And I don't think that there would have been anything that the defense could have gained by trying to cross-examine her.
You mentioned the assistant. So Diddy's former assistant, George Kaplan, he talked about how part of his job was setting up the hotel stays for the freak-offs. But, he was also kind of in awe of Diddy professionally. He kind of spoke about him as if he was some sort of like mentor, godlike figure. What did you make of his testimony, and how is it relevant to the RICO charges?
I thought his testimony was very powerful because, one, it showed his loyalty to Diddy, because he showed up and said, I don't want to be here. I was subpoenaed here. And then he was going to plead the fifth, and the judge absolutely gave him immunity. So what they were saying was, he was saying a few things in his testimony. He was stating that, one, he really learned a lot from this man. This guy was larger than life. He said, I just wanted to learn from him. So again, we are painting the prosecution is painting a picture of this mogul, right? This person who has this multifaceted business enterprise, who everybody wants to be in his orbit. I thought that was a very powerful statement from him. He also talked about the fact that he just did what he wanted to do. He worked these long hours, which in some instances, lends itself to the forced labor charges. He said that, I believe this was George Kaplan, or it could have been David James, the other assistants, that said, sometimes we worked 72 hours. We worked long hours. One assistant even passed out and had to go to the hospital to get rehydrated. Again, this goes to the point of forced labor. But in terms of his testimony, saying, look, I learned a lot from this guy. He's larger than life, and I did what I had to do to please him. So I thought his testimony was truthful. It came across truthful. It came across reluctant, but it also gave a very colorful picture, a very powerful picture of what it was like to work for Diddy.
So the week ended with makeup artist Mila Morales and Kid Cudi taking the stand. So let's start with Mila. So I actually interviewed her. I was her first interview last year, and she shared a story. I spoke with her for Extra, and she shared a story about an incident of hearing Diddy allegedly beating Cassie in a hotel room. And essentially, it's the exact same thing that she said on Stand. Yeah. I was already familiar with it because I interviewed her, and she did some subsequent interviews with some other outlets.
You were always scared of Puff. Like, he's a powerful person, and we don't know what would happen to us if we spoke out.
But how are these stories of abuse and the corroboration of abuse moving the needle?
Again, they want to reinforce the fact that that she was abused, for one, but, forced by, the fact that she really loved this man and kept going back. And that is why it was important that they brought in the psychologist who testified, the fact that, listen, it's typical for abused women to go back to them, and talked about the power dynamic. So yes, she was there to testify. She wasn't on the stand very long. She was really there to reinforce Cassie's story that Cassie herself had brought up, again, to give credibility to Cassie's story. But it's important, again, that the prosecution steer the focus back to how this factors into it. It's not domestic violence. Remember, he is not being charged with domestic violence. This is to show force, fraud, or coercion as related to the sex trafficking charges as victim number one. But again, her testimony was quick, to the point, and corroborated exactly what Cassie had testified to last week.
Do you think moving forward that we're going to hear more and more about Cassie being abused and his physical violence against her, or do you think that's going to die down in the upcoming weeks?
It will probably, I would hope that it would die down. They might bring it up, periodically throughout the trial. They do have a victim number two that they have also charged with sex trafficking, who was a victim of the alleged sex trafficking. So I think at one point we'll move on to that. But again, you need to corroborate what Cassie said, because you want to be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt to the jurors that yes, she was in this domestic violence relationship that controlled her movements, that controlled her psyche. She was in a power dynamic, and that she really loved this man, because that is what Cassie said. Listen, all I wanted to do was please him, to spend time with him. And so I think that was important for those markers, but I don't think that they will continue if the prosecution, in my opinion, wants to, move the needle some more. They're going to need to really talk about the other charges. And I would anticipate that they would do that, because next week we're going to hear from people that were related to the Kid Cudi allegations that he stated in terms of breaking and entering and the alleged
and the car,
the arson. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's talk about that actually, because Kid Cudi, we finally saw photographic proof that someone bombed his car, and he alleges it was Diddy, but we still haven't seen any evidence of that. So how relevant is his testimony?
Well, again, you're going to have a principal witness to come to the stand and set the stage, which is what he did. And so next week, you are going to hear from one of Diddy's associates that actually made the alleged phone call to Kid Cudi and said, hey, Diddy is in your house. So it is relevant in terms of, there was no eyewitness to the alleged arson. There was no eyewitness to the alleged breaking and entering. But again, you have circumstantial evidence, and it is up to the prosecution to go ahead and establish what this man is saying is truth. Mm-hmm. And so I would assume that is what they will bring the former Combs employee to the stand to testify and to corroborate, yes, I made that phone call. And yes, so the jury, again, this is a question for the jury. Do you believe this man's testimony beyond a reasonable doubt enough to talk and convince you that this defendant is guilty of arson? And in the indictment, they mentioned that it is multiple acts of arson. And again, this is circumstantial evidence because there was no proof that anybody did it. But if you bring in enough people to corroborate the testimony, that means that they are trying to establish that this testimony is truthful, and he had reason to believe that. And that is what these backup witnesses are going to establish.
So right now it sounds like these first couple of weeks we're still setting the stage, and moving forward we're going to hear, I'm assuming we're going to hear more witnesses to corroborate what we've been told over these past couple of weeks. Is that where this case is going, would you say?
Right. Well, you look at Cassie, when she came in to talk about her testimony, there were people that were brought in to corroborate: her mother, her best friend, Dawn Richard, the assistants had witnessed the abuse. Others had witnessed the abuse. So they have established that. And so they move on from that, right? And so what you would do now is move on to the next. We talked about Kid Cudi. All right. He is another principal witness because that is a charge in the indictment that he committed multiple acts of arson. So Kid Cudi said it, and now they will begin to bring in people to fill in and to broaden that inference, and what he is saying is allegedly true. Again, nobody saw it, so you need eyewitnesses to say, yes, I was there, I made that phone call. Because remember, when he got back to his house, there was nobody there. However, would you reasonably believe that somebody called called Kid Cudi and said, hey, Diddy is in your house? And then he calls Diddy, and Diddy allegedly says, yo, I just want to talk to you. Okay, great, I'm on my way home. You get there, nobody is there, but somebody just told you that he was there. You get home, the security cameras are moved. Your dog is locked in the bathroom. Presents that you had wrapped for Christmas are open. So would a reasonable person believe that it was Diddy in the house, especially if after one of Diddy's employees, who they're going to bring to the stand next week, alleges that? It depends on what the person says, but that is what the prosecution has alleged. I'm assuming has interviewed this person and knows what he's going to say to establish that, to fill in, again, the doubts. And so each time you're going to have somebody, the principal witness, come on the stand, and they're going to bring other people in to establish that, yes, this person is telling the truth and this is what is happening. So they're building out a picture.
I see. So with that in mind, who do we need to hear from in the coming weeks? Who would you say that we need to hear from in the coming weeks?
That's a good question. You're going to hear from people that would be able to testify to the criminal enterprise, the forced labor. So I believe that they'll bring in people from the Combs Enterprises to talk about, yes, I worked to exhaustion. I passed out. Because a lot of this stuff, you don't want to get in the person's mind. Well, that's hearsay. Again, there are evidentiary rules around that, but that's what he said. Did this person pass out? Did this person witness? You're going to also hear, I would assume, from people that are higher up that were named in other civil complaints, such as his assistant, his former chief of staff, Ms. Karan, and I would assume, again, there was the Harvey Pierre, who was the president of Bad Boy Records, because both of those people are alleged of certain crimes and witness to certain crimes, or alleged to be involved in certain crimes in these civil cases. Again, a lot of this was built on these civil cases that were originally filed, not from the perspective of they're connecting these dots, but when the SDNY or the feds get involved, there is enough circumstantial evidence as they start to look into it. So that is what I'm assuming, that we'll continue to hear from security staff, household staff, people that were involved in these raids perhaps. And remember that we only saw that one house was raided. That was his Miami house. But you remember prior to that, a few hours prior to that, they had raided his Los Angeles house. We haven't heard of anybody, and we have not seen any of the evidence. So they're going to talk about that. What was found in that house? Were there more weapons found in there? Were there more drugs found in there? Those are the things that the prosecution is going to start to establish.
All right, so Lisa, it's still early, but based on the testimonies that we've heard and the damaging video that we've seen, Cassie in the hotel room and him pulling her back into the room, or in the hallway rather, how likely is it that Diddy will take the stand?
It's highly unlikely that Diddy will take the stand. And I just want to remind people that just because a person does not take the stand, if you're a juror, that does not infer or imply that this person is guilty. That is one that's going to be in the jury instructions. That's clear across these criminal trials. However, the reason that he is not going to take the stand is because once you take the stand, everything that you have ever done related to any of these alleged crimes becomes fair game. And you are sworn in, and you are under oath for fear of perjury, and you can go to jail, to prison for perjury. So you want to avoid taking the stand for fear of self-incrimination. I just believe that considering this is the SDNY, I personally would believe that there is a lot of evidence that would be presented, even up until now, that I would not want to have to answer if I were Diddy. For example, did you drop the Molotov cocktail in this car, Or did you have any involvement in that? Were you standing in Kid Cudi's house at any time? He has to answer that if he were on the stand, truthfully. Yeah. And so now, if you don't take the stand, again, you look at what the defense has poked holes in terms of the allegations in the indictment, and you put everything together, all the evidence that the prosecution has presented over these past 8 weeks, you get jury instructions, and you are only to, as a juror, only to listen to what was instructed, what is in the transcript, and what is in the jury instructions. You not any outside noise, and how the law is framed. And you take all of that into consideration. And really, your instructions at that point are, do you believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant has committed these crimes? And that's it. So Diddy I would be absolutely surprised if he would take the stand. Defendants rarely do take the stand. There is nothing to gain, especially if you have any skeletons in your closet.
It's the end of week 3 in the United States Southern District of New York versus Sean Diddy Combs. We heard testimonies from former assistants, one who alleges he sexually assaulted her multiple times, a stylist, the LAPD, and LAFD. But there's also some happier news this week. Diddy's ex and the prosecution's principal witness, Cassie Ventura, and her husband, Alex Fine, welcomed their third child 2 weeks after she testified. But we're here to talk about the trial, and y'all know I've got questions. Joining me to connect the dots and break down what this week means in Diddy's courtroom saga is entertainment lawyer, former litigator, and legal correspondent Lisa Bonner. Lisa, how you doing?
I'm well, Carlos. How are you?
I am well, ready to break all of this down, you know? So
Lots
Lisa,
to break down.
A lot. Another explosive week. So Lisa, we know Diddy is deviant and violent. He's been established as a monster. But that's not what he's on trial for. And, you know, I'm probably going to ask you this question every week because we want to keep people on track. Remind us why he's facing life in prison. What are the charges?
He has 5 counts against him. They are RICO. RICO includes multiple acts of arson, the kidnapping, possession of narcotics with the intent to distribute. He's got a lot of predicate crimes that underlie a RICO, but also the RICO makes it come into effect through the fact that he is using his company and people that work for him in furtherance of these crimes. As sex trafficking is principal, which is why I wanted to go last, because we've got a lot of that to talk about and how these crimes tie into the alleged sex trafficking. But sex trafficking is a part of the RICO charge as well. Diddy also has a count of transportation for the purposes of prostitution, and also has another separate sex trafficking charge. So there are a lot of charges that are 5 in total, but they are broken down into a RICO charge and the 2 other, the sex trafficking and the transportation for the purposes of prostitution, like I said. So it's a lot, and it is admittedly very confusing, and that's why I'm so glad we're here to talk about it and break it down from a legal perspective.
Right. Well, let's discuss let's talk about who we heard from this week and what this could all mean for Diddy's fate. So starting with his former assistant, who was anonymous. She went by the pseudonym Mia. So she testified on Thursday and Friday. Talk to me, what does she have to say about her former boss, and why is her testimony crucial to this case?
That's a great question, Carlos. So talking about Mia, who is testifying under pseudonym, but also as victim number 2 in the indictment. And her testimony is key for several reasons. One, it corroborates a lot of the control element that we've heard from Cassie about in terms of the sex trafficking of Cassie, which was very important. Basically, she testified that Diddy was in control of everything in her life, and from her apartment to her music, to her nails, to every literally thing in her orbit. So she talked about that. She corroborated the fact that Cassie was not free to leave, that he had threatened her through his withholding of her music, threatening to send sex tapes of the freak off to her parents. So she was very key in that, in corroborating Cassie's part of the sex trafficking as far as a control element. She was also very central to the case in fleshing out the narrative, another narrative under the RICO charge, which is the possession of narcotics with the intent to distribute. So she talked about the ketamine and how Diddy forced her to do ketamine in Miami. So that was a very crucial element as well. And now she is starting to also testify on Thursday about her being trafficked in terms of, and it's clear that we human trafficking and sex trafficking are all somehow a lot of times conflated, but sex trafficking is moving someone across, it could be across the street to another environment for the purposes of unwanted sex or sex with a commercial worker. So that's very important. So in her instance, she tied together another element of that she was sexually abused in various places, which feeds into victim number 2 being sex trafficked. So she was crucial in so many ways.
Okay. Well, earlier in the week, we heard from another assistant, Capricorn Clark. She testified, and she worked for him for many years. And Capricorn, she painted a picture of a mob-like boss who would often threaten to kill her. And she's also the one whom Kid Cudi said admitted Diddy broke into his house when he took the stand last week. What did you make of her testimony, and what does it mean for the racketeering charges he's facing?
Great question. Well, a lot of the assistants, and that's another thing, have worked, as did Capricorn, for him for a very long time. Capricorn, like Mia, and like the former ones that we saw last week, George and the other assistant, they all talked about an element of allegiance to him. So that is important in terms of establishing her credibility. Like, she really wanted to please him. But she also talked about, as you mentioned, the fact that Diddy and his people were there at the scene of the alleged crime of the breaking and entering into Kid Cudi's house. Very important. She was another reason that she was very important and central to the testimony was because she talked about the fact that she really was friends with both of them, and how she did not appear to have anything to gain in terms of testifying one way or the other. It came
you mean
across
both
as very
friends
truthful.
With Cassie and Diddy?
Cassie, yes,
Okay.
Cassie and Diddy. She was friendly with both of them. Again, she was there basically to talk about her element of what happened to Cassie, but from a neutral point of view. She also talked about, the forced labor, which is another predicate crime under RICO, as did Mia, and as did George Kaplan, and everyone who has talked about it from working with Diddy has talked about working to the point of exhaustion, which is a predicate crime under RICO. So there are a lot of different elements from each different witness, but they are all feeding into various narratives. But the one thing that we've pretty much seen consistent is the element of control that Diddy had over Cassie. Each person is alleging that in their own way, and also corroborating a lot of the stories that we've heard from the previous witnesses.
Okay, so we also heard from the stylist, Deontay Nash. He took the stand and he corroborated that Diddy was emotionally and physically abusive to Cassie. Now, the defense is trying to poke holes in all of their stories. That's their job. That's what they're there to do. And it seems like their strategy is to paint them as hanger-on to kind of craved access to Diddy's celebrity and fame. Do you think it's been an effective strategy? And would you say the defense has had a rocky week? Well, let's go back. Do you think it's been an effective strategy first?
Well, it's a strategy, and it depends on how the jury is going to perceive a lot of this, right? And they are doing the best that they can, as I've said, with what they have. Listen, everybody knows Diddy. This is one of the trials that is talked about across the world. So any reasonable person would know that this is a man who is larger than life, who makes or breaks careers. I mean, we talked about Mary J. Blige. I mean, the roster goes on and on. Biggie, everybody. So of course you wanted to be with Puffy, but aside from that, the important element that we are discussing here is the abuse and the emotional and financial manipulation that he extorted, that he held over these people. And so it is very complex. It really is going to go, as I've said before, a lot is going to lead into the jury instructions and the closing arguments in particular to see how they wrap all of this up, and the other people that they bring in. They're doing the best they can, but you have to, would a reasonable person, that is the standard that they are supposed to take, would a reasonable person really believe that what these people are saying is true? And that is why it is so important for the prosecution to have a substantial narrative that is similar throughout all of these plaintiffs, to establish a pattern of activity that is used through his enterprise. So of course he had great parties. That was part of the puffy bad boy brand, but that same brand was also responsible for allegedly kidnapping one of his employees, taking her at gunpoint and driving up to Kid Cudi's house to commit another crime, which is breaking and entering. That's the narrative that the prosecution has to go with. It's very important to underscore and to humanize and to put it into perspective for the jury, so they could, if they want to get to proving that RICO.
Right. Well, let's talk about the defense. Let's talk about the week that they've had. You know, they're begging the judge for more time with Diddy, and midweek the judge denied their motion for a mistrial. What caused them to request a mistrial, and how do you think that played out with the jury?
Well, that is a question that is talked about this week, and it is very dramatic. And it did unfold in very dramatic testimony from what I can understand. So what led up to that was the Los Angeles investigator for the Los Angeles Fire Department. He was on the stand and basically talked about, was corroborating a lot of the arson, and talked about the fingerprints and that caught that the Yes, I'm sorry, at Kid Cudi's house, and talked about the arson, that they normally keep a set of fingerprint cards on file, and he would be the one to sign off on them if they were to be destroyed. In this instance, they were destroyed, but he did not sign off on them. So the inference immediately is, according to the defense, is like, listen, the inference that you're drawing is the fact that Combs is larger than life, and he somehow paid these people, and people were in his pocket to help commit crimes when you don't really have any evidence of that. And so they not only asked for a mistrial, they also asked for that to be stated as that was improper in the record. The judge denied both. And the reason why it is important that the judge denied the mistrial is because they want to preserve every element and possibility for appeal that they can. But also the judge refused to strike it as improper from the record because of the fact that that then underscores from the prosecution side that they somehow acted improper as an even greater grounds for appeal. So the judge admonished them and told them they were walking a fine line, but did not grant a mistrial, in my opinion, which is right. But it is a slippery slope, and you have to be very careful. And they were admonished properly, in my opinion, through the judge, for what the judge did.
All right. We heard more about, the aftermath of the freak-offs and, the hotel rooms and how they were covered in menstrual blood and candle wax and broken glass. We got that picture. Why are these details important?
Again, the people that worked for Diddy that have testified, aside from Cassie, that was important for her to establish what it looked like, right, to set the scene. In terms of the candle wax and the incense and all of the things in the aftermath that they had to clean up, is because one of the elements of the enterprise is that he used his employees to protect his reputation and conceal his conduct. And that is one of the things that each and every assistant testified to, that it was my responsibility to protect him at all times. And again, these are Combs' employees of these enterprises and of these companies. So that is important to really weave that narrative in terms of the fact that they were there to protect him. Now, it was interesting that Mia actually had a checklist that she prepared because Diddy one time was berating her about, what do you do all day? And she was like, well, let me tell you. So she had an email which was very effective. And in that email, it said, protect your his reputation at all time. Protect PD's reputation, and just very clear the fact that she was there to manage him, to keep his reputation clean, and to make sure that he appeared in the best light possible. So that's a string that goes through the RICO in the trafficking.
Okay. Was there any bombshell or smoking gun this week for the prosecution?
I would say Mia was super effective. I think the prosecution had a good week, but the bombshell, I would say, was Mia. Okay. Because Mia was a very reluctant witness. She said, I would have taken the secret to my grave. I did not want to talk about this. I did not have any interest. Even when I approached lawyers for a severance, I never ever mentioned this. And that was important because she really had nothing to gain. Again, she was there, she was crying, she was emotional, had her head down, she testified under a pseudonym, and even in the court reports, they said the most prominent thing about her is the part in her hair, because she is very shrunken into herself and does not want to really be there. She said, but I was subpoenaed, I have to be here, and I have to tell the story. I am traumatized. She said, I mean, it gives her PTSD. So I think that plays into the narrative from a jury perspective of really seeing that this girl has nothing to gain and everything to lose if somebody pieces the parts together of the puzzle. This is a very small business in the entertainment industry. So you do a little digging and one could easily find out who that is. And that is very dangerous for her reputation. And nobody would want to be famous or infamous for any of these allegations that she has set forth. So she was very, very damaging and very effective. So I think that was the most bombshell. But all of it was really, this was a good week for the prosecution in terms of building out the elements of RICO. As I have said before, that's what they need to do. There's still more to go, but they are really building an effective case.
Yeah. Well, that was my next question. I mean, you said they had a good week, so, well, you kind of answered it, but in your legal opinion, at this stage, how are they doing? How is the prosecution doing proving that Combs ran a criminal enterprise?
I think that they are connecting the dots. They have started laying out the predicate crimes of RICO. We had breaking and entering, we had arson, we had kidnapping, we have elements of control that feed into the sex trafficking. Those were corroborated. We had bribery, extortion, ketamine, concealing conduct. We had everything to establish a pattern of behavior that was conducted through his business that alleged a criminal enterprise. So I think they have done a lot. If they had to rest today, would they be there? I think not. But I do know that they have at least 2 more weeks of testimony, and they have some work to do to close the loop. But if they bring in KK, his former chief of staff, Christine Caron, and they bring in D-Rock, each of whom has been mentioned, D-Rock and the security guard, each of whom has been mentioned 3 or 4 dozen times throughout the trial of these past 3 weeks. These are people that were not assistants and working under him, but people who allegedly worked with him. As the chief of staff, Christina did everything and knew of these crimes and alleged crimes and continued to chime in to further it. If they bring her in and she can establish that she was following orders and same with D-Rock, the security guard, and they were employed by Combs, that would bring it home and land the plane. Other than that, because these 2 people are mentioned so frequently, if they don't come in, that's kind of like, Now they might have to cut a deal, grant some immunity or otherwise, but they need those 2 higher ups to come in to really hit it home.
Right. So, I mean, the trial is expected to last 8 weeks and we're hitting the halfway mark. What can we expect next week?
Next week, allegedly, there's going to be another victim that comes forward again, which will show a pattern of behavior from Combs. So we'll see what she testifies about. But if it's a third victim that comes forth and talks about the sex trafficking and corroborates the same narrative that we've heard over and over and over again about the control, about the abuse, about the manipulation, about the other criminal elements that come into RICO, especially if this person was affiliated, this alleged victim was affiliated with him in any way in terms of his businesses, that's going to be another way to really hit it home. And so we can look forward to that. And like I said, we need higher ups, that people that have been mentioned previously in these lawsuits. Again, I would suspect and hope that the prosecution would bring in the security guard and his former chief of staff to corroborate what we have heard and what each person has testified to about these people knew. They came, Christina was sending emails stating that you had to come back. She was calling incessantly at Diddy's request, that the security guard was either with Diddy in terms of the kidnapping or was one of the people that did something to go and retrieve Cassie. There's so many instances of these alleged higher up individuals that were working with him to facilitate and conspire with him under his employ. That is going to be something that we're going to need to see.